Okay, part two. I'll talk a little bit about the manifold and some things that I've learned on that. Because you have 8 throttle bodies, the throttle blades, I should say, at idle, you have to pretty much shut them almost completely down in order to make it idle, because just a little bit of a throttle opening creates a lot of airflow, and engine speed will take off, especially if you've got, a light rotating assembly, a light flywheel. That it's hard to idle them down. idle is kind of a problem with these things. If you get it once you get it to idle, I'll be honest with you, ignition time, get your timing where you want it, figure out where that's going to be, and then get it to idle from there, and then leave your timing alone, because even a couple degrees of timing one way or the other will affect idle speed, and you'll chase it, because you got to move both throttle blades exactly the same time, and you also need to have all 8 blades with the same type of clearance. I'm not going to take this all apart and show you, but it suffices to say you take all these stacks out to get to the blades, and then I close them all down, and I take like a 1,000th feeler gauge, and I drop it down in between the blade and the bore, and I get them all to drag about the same amount, as close as I can get, so that they're even. You can loosen the blades and get them set, and you need to do this when it's bolted to the engine and torqued down, because quite honestly, it will change. This one's pretty good. My machinist is pretty good. He's got the heads and everything. We spent some time fitting the manifold to the engine, so that's kind of critical. One of the early engines I put this on, when I torque it down, it definitely would change it. This one doesn't seem to do that, but it's something to think about. You can set it all up on a bench and get it close, but I'll be honest with you, you really need to do the final throttle blade adjustment with it on the engine. The other thing that I've seen guys try to do, because the throttle blades you need to close them so far, is they want to take these screws out. See this screw right here for the that's a stop. All right, they'll take that stop completely out and let the blades jam tight against the bore. That doesn't work, and I'll tell you why. Because as the engine's running, you rev it up, and when you shut the throttle and those blades slam shut, they never slam shut the same way. It will actually suck the blade into the bore, and it'll be way inconsistent. It'll be revving up, or it'll stall. It'll do all kind of weird stuff. You must put that's why it's on here. There is a throttle stop, and you need to get them both the same. I got one on both shafts. There's one on the back here as well, on this side blade and this one. The other thing you need to do with these are out is, once you get your blades set where they need to be, you need to get your fingers on there, even a dial indicator if you can do it. I do it with my fingers. I basically touch both sides, both blades, and move the throttle with my other hand, and I get this adjusted to where they both move exactly the same. If you've heard some cars that have injection, like one side will be firing, the other side won't be, or as you rev it up, one side will get louder before the other side, because they're not evenly set. You got to get them very in your linkage. You got to take all of the play out of the linkage that you can. I've worked hard on the linkage on this thing to try to do it, to get it to where there's no play anywhere. This is my linkage set up right here, the way it works. I got my return line running through there. That's the safest place for it. It doesn't hit anything anywhere. I've got 2 return springs, one here and one over here. Plus there are springs on the shafts themselves, so it's pretty safe that way. The other thing that's very critical is there's some adjustment, at least on this one, on the barrel valve linkage. This is your adjustment for rich lean from idle and engine feed as well. That barrel valve in there is exactly what it is. As this opens, it allows more and more fuel into the engine. As it closes, it comes down to the idle and does the idle bypass. When I got this thing, it was a mess. This linkage, this is clamped onto here, and I had to get these arms so that they were exactly the same, so that was they stayed parallel, because they weren't. That was critical on this one. They're probably not all manifolds are not the same, but I'd say that they should run parallel as you can get them. That's super critical. And then This one also had different adjustments that you could drop one down and it was off. I don't know who had this before, but so I took all that apart and I set this all up that way. That's something I learned on my own. Nobody really told me anything, but I thought, man, that's the way it was engineered. I would think that's the way you'd want to run it. So, you know, this is something that you'll have to adjust once you get it running. You basically can kind of lean this down. If the barrel's right and you get everything right, this is kind of one of your final adjustments that'll come in later that, you know, you'll get it to idle, and then you want to accelerate. You know, when you accelerate it, it doesn't want to hesitate, but you don't want it smoking either. You know, you don't want it to be lean stumble or a rich stumble either. And the dyno would help you on that. That's the other thing about this, to really get it fine tuned. I mean, you can get them up and running, but to get it tuned, quite honestly, you got to have it on a dyno. So one other thing I'll talk about on the manifold here is you'll notice that I have my throttle blades are right in here. Okay. I'm sorry, right in here. Here's the throttle blades are in the middle. You see the shaft going there, and you'll see that there's holes right here for nozzles. You could put nozzles up here, or you can put nozzles below the throttle blades. I've tried them both. I've had them up here and I've had them down here. I've talked to some people. Quite honestly, I was told that up here it was better, like on gasoline. There's all kind of wives' tales out there. They said it would idle better up here. I didn't find that. And what I discovered is that it's not as stable, it doesn't seem up here, because the throttle blades are so close. So the fuel's almost kind of like dripping in there and sitting on the throttle blades. And then plus, you know, that's less air. You got fuel in there that take up room of the air that could be going into the engine. So I believe you're going to make more power with the nozzles as close to the engine as the chamber as you can get. Quite honestly, I ought to have down nozzles on this, but I don't. But so the other thing that changes when you do this, the pressure, if you put a gauge on this, and I may do that if I got time, put a pressure gauge on here. It's nice to know what the fuel pressure is, especially when you get on the dyno. But what happens with it up here is the fuel pressure would be higher at idle than it is down here. And I couldn't figure out why at first, but then it struck me that I got engine vacuum sucking on these lines, the nozzle down here when it's at idle, and then you know, when it's up here, there's nothing. I mean, it's just there's hardly any vacuum or anything. So whatever pressure it's squirting in here, it's going into here. And so when this thing idles, the way I have it set up right now, there's hardly any fuel pressure. I mean, it's only got like 3 or 4 pounds of fuel pressure, maybe. I have to put a gauge on, I don't remember, but it's not very much. But I don't think that's accurate because, like I said, the engine's sucking on it really hard because there's high vacuum from the throttle being closed. And so the pump's putting out pressure, more pressure than it's showing on a gauge. And, you know, you get a big, it's sucking on the back side of that nozzle. So, you know, all 8 of them actually. So it doesn't show much pressure. But as long as it's got enough to make it run, that's all that matters. I mean, this thing does pretty good. Quite honestly, I believe this manifold was set up for alcohol originally. And they tell me that the barrel valve itself is different between gasoline and alcohol. And this is the only barrel valve I've ever had. So I kind of tend to believe that this is probably not the best, the right barrel valve for gasoline, but I've made it work. And, you know, I don't think this thing runs as good as it could. There's a couple other things I think I could do to make it work, but I have to get it on a dyno again. But it does pretty good. I mean, it idles good. It doesn't load the plugs up. It makes good power. It doesn't have any flat spots or anywhere. I mean, you know, I think there's more power in it. A couple things I'd like to try, but it's not bad. I think it's probably 95% of where it could be right now. So those are some things that I'll give you for that, and that's probably the end of part 2. It'll probably be tomorrow before I'll show you my startup and shutdown procedures, and we'll talk more about that.